It was March 15th, 1962. I was 7 months pregnant alone in my bedroom when Jerome Wilson forced his way through my door for the last time. The cream-colored fabric of my maternity dress, the one I'd sewn myself with such hope, split at the shoulder as I tried to push him away. That sound, that awful ripping, became the soundtrack to my awakening. My name is Helen. I'm 84 years old now, and I'm about to tell you a story that took me 60 years to fully understand. A story about power, silence, and the price we pay for both. If you think you know how these stories end, you don't. Not this one. The blood on my hands that afternoon wasn't mine. I was born in 1941 in Riverdale, Virginia, when the world was already burning around the edges. My father ran the only pharmacy in town. My mother gave piano lessons to daughters of families who mattered. We lived quietly, respectably, within the careful boundaries that kept small-town life stable. I learned early that a woman's reputation was more fragile than butterfly wings and just as easily destroyed. Helen, a lady never raises her voice," my mother would say, adjusting my posture at the breakfast table. "A lady never draws attention to herself." I was good at being invisible. Good at being quiet. Good at being everything a proper young woman should be. In 1959, when I first saw Anthony Wilson at the 4th of July celebration. He was different from the other boys. He'd been to college, spoke about books and ideas that made my heart race. When he smiled at me across the church steps, I felt my carefully constructed world tilt on its axis. "You're the pharmacist's daughter," he said, approaching with a confidence that seemed to bend gravity around him. "I've heard you're quite the scholar." "I teach children," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing too impressive. Intelligence is always impressive," he said, and I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. Anthony was Jerome Wilson's son. Jerome Wilson, the man who owned the textile factory, half the town's businesses, and most of the people who worked in them. The Wilson name opened doors, commanded respect, struck fear into hearts. When Anthony began courting me, my parents could barely contain their excitement. "The Wilson boy," my father said, polishing his glasses with unusual vigor. "Helen, do you understand what this means for our family?" I understood that it meant everything. In Riverdale, the Wilsons were royalty, and I was about to become a princess. The engagement announcement in the county newspaper made front-page news. For 6 weeks, I was the most envied girl in 3 counties. I should have paid attention to the way the older women's smiles never quite reached their eyes. The first time I met Jerome Wilson, I was wearing my best dress, navy blue, with small white flowers sewn by my mother's own hands. Anthony had insisted on a formal introduction at the family estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion that loomed over the town like a benevolent threat. "So this is the young lady who's captured my son's heart," Jerome said, taking my gloved hand in his. His grip lingered 3 seconds too long. His eyes traveled from my face to my throat, down to my carefully concealed collarbone, and back up again. "Anthony, you've chosen well. Very well indeed, Mrs. Cecilia Wilson." Anthony's mother watched this exchange with the alert stillness of a rabbit sensing a hawk. She was a woman who had learned to read danger in the angle of a smile, the duration of a handshake, the quality of silence after certain words were spoken. "Helen has teaching credentials," Anthony said proudly. "She's quite accomplished." How charming," Jerome replied, his voice warm as honey over broken glass. "Of course, once you're married, you'll have no need for such pursuits. A Wilson woman has more important duties." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration of ownership spoken with the casual certainty of a man who had never been told no. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I smiled and nodded because that's what proper young women did. The wedding preparations began immediately. Jerome insisted on paying for everything: the dress, the flowers, the reception at the country club. "Nothing too elaborate," he said, "but befitting our family's position." Every decision required his approval. Every detail bore his influence. I began to feel less like a bride and more like a doll being dressed for someone else's amusement. It was during one of these preparation sessions that the touching began. I was standing in the fitting room at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, surrounded by white silk and my mother's tears of joy when Jerome entered without knocking. I wanted to see how our princess looks, he said, his eyes taking inventory of my half-dressed form. Mr. Wilson, I stammered, reaching for my robe. I'm not decent, he smiled, moving closer. My dear, you're going to be my daughter soon. No need for modesty between family. His hand found my waist as he walked behind me, ostensibly, to examine the dress's fit. His fingers pressed against my ribs, counted them like rosary beads. Perfect, he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. Absolutely perfect. Mrs. Patterson bustled in with pins and measuring tape, breaking the spell. Jerome stepped back instantly, becoming the respectable father-in-law again. Beautiful work, Mrs. Patterson. Spare no expense. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the hunger in his eyes, trying to believe that important men were simply more familiar, more confident in their interactions, trying to silence the voice in my head that whispered, "Run." The incidents multiplied like cancer cells. A hand on my shoulder that slid down to my lower back. Compliments about my figure that made my skin crawl. Moments when I'd turn around to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't name, but that made my stomach clench with primitive fear. 3 weeks before the wedding, Anthony traveled to Richmond on business. I'll be gone 5 days, he said, kissing my cheek. Father promised to look after you. That promise was both a blessing and a curse. Jerome arrived at my parents' house on the second day, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. A pre-wedding gift, he said, settling into our modest living room like a king claiming new territory. Something special I think you'll appreciate. My mother fluttered around him like a nervous bird offering tea and cookies, clearly overwhelmed by the honor of his visit. My father wasn't home. He was at the pharmacy, unaware that his daughter was about to receive an education in the mathematics of power. Helen, why don't you show Mr. Wilson the garden? My mother suggested. The roses are particularly beautiful this year. The garden was private, enclosed by high hedges that turned afternoon sunlight into something dim and secret. Jerome unwrapped his package slowly, revealing a length of cream-colored silk that caught the light like captured moonbeams. Feel it, he said, holding the fabric toward me. Feel how soft it is. I touched the silk with one finger. It was indeed soft, softer than anything I'd ever felt. It's beautiful, I said. Like you, he replied, and suddenly the silk was around my wrists, not roughly but firmly binding my hands together. I wanted to see how it would look against your skin. The world tilted sideways. Mr. Wilson, I don't think... Shh, he whispered, his free hand tracing the line of my jaw. You're going to be my daughter, Helen. My beautiful, obedient daughter. And daughters trust their fathers, don't they? What happened next took less than 3 minutes and changed the trajectory of my entire life. When it was over, I was sitting on the ground among my mother's prized roses, the silk still wrapped around my wrists like expensive shackles, blood on my torn dress, and Jerome Wilson straightening his tie with the satisfied air of a man who had just concluded a successful business transaction. If you tell anyone about this, he said, his voice conversational, I'll destroy your family. Your father's pharmacy license can be revoked with one phone call. Your mother's piano students come from families who depend on me for their livelihoods. Anthony will never believe you. He worships me. And who else would? You're nobody, Helen, a pharmacist's daughter who got lucky. Don't forget that. He walked away, leaving me alone with the roses and the terrible knowledge that my life as I knew it was over. I stumbled into the house past my mother, who was humming cheerfully in the kitchen, up the stairs to my childhood bedroom. I sat on the bed I'd slept in for 18 years and tried to understand what had just happened to me. Tried to fit this new reality into the world I thought I knew. The wedding was in 17 days. The invitations had been sent. The dress was being finished. The cake was ordered. The entire town was expecting a celebration. I was trapped in a fairy tale that had become a nightmare, and the monster wore a respectable man's face. For the next 2 weeks, I moved through my days like a sleepwalker. I smiled at the right moments, responded to questions with appropriate enthusiasm, participated in the final preparations with the mechanical precision of a wind-up toy. Inside, I was screaming. Jerome sent flowers to mark the occasion. To my future daughter, the card read, "With all my love." Anthony returned from Richmond glowing with success. "I've secured 3 new contracts," he announced, spinning me around our front parlor. "We're going to have a wonderful life, Helen. A wonderful, prosperous life." I tried to match his enthusiasm, but every time I looked at him, I saw his father's face. Every time he touched me, I felt Jerome's hands. Every time he spoke about our future, I heard the echo of threats whispered in a rose garden. The wedding day arrived with obscene punctuality. June 15th, 1960. The weather was perfect, clear skies, gentle breeze temperatures just warm enough to make the church flowers release their perfume into the air. I walked down the aisle in my mother's redesigned dress, my father's proud arms supporting me toward Anthony, who waited at the altar with tears in his eyes. In the front pew, Jerome Wilson watched with the satisfied expression of a man who had just acquired a particularly valuable piece of property. We moved into the house Jerome had built for us, a smaller version of the family mansion positioned strategically where he could see our windows from his study. To keep the family close, he explained, but I knew better. It was a watchtower, a way to monitor his investment. Anthony threw himself into his work, with the enthusiasm of a man proving himself worthy of his inheritance. He left early, returned late, and spent many evenings at the factory discussing expansion plans with his father. I was left alone in our beautiful house, waiting for the sound of Jerome's key in the lock. The visits began 3 days after we returned from our honeymoon. "I wanted to see how you're settling in," he said, letting himself in while Anthony was at the factory. A father's duty to his daughter-in-law. I backed away from him, my hands instinctively moving to protect my stomach, even though I wasn't pregnant yet. "Anthony isn't here." "I know," he said, moving closer. "I sent him to inspect the warehouse. He won't be back for hours." What followed was a pattern that would define the next 2 years of my life. Jerome would find reasons to visit when Anthony was away. He would find excuses to touch me. He would remind me with casual cruelty of my place in the world and the consequences of forgetting it. "You're getting thin," he observed one afternoon, his hand on my waist as I stood frozen by the kitchen sink. "Are you eating enough? We can't have you wasting away." I wasn't eating enough. I was barely eating at all. Food had become my enemy, my stomach, a constant knot of anxiety and disgust. I was disappearing bit by bit like a photograph left in the sun. "I'm fine," I whispered, because any other answer would invite questions I couldn't answer. Are you—" His thumb traced the edge of my ribs. "You don't seem fine to me. You seem troubled. Is there something wrong in your marriage, Helen? Something you need to discuss with your father-in-law?" The questions were traps, each one designed to elicit an admission of guilt, a confession of inadequacy. I learned to navigate them like a mouse in a maze, always seeking the path that led to the fewest consequences. 6 months into my marriage, I discovered I was pregnant. For one shining moment, I thought everything would change. Surely Jerome would leave me alone now. Surely the approaching arrival of his grandchild would protect me from his attention. I was wrong. "A baby," he said when I told him, his hand immediately moving to my still flat stomach. How wonderful! My grandchild growing inside my beautiful daughter-in-law. The possessiveness in his voice made my skin crawl. This wasn't celebration, it was claiming. He wasn't just congratulating me. He was claiming ownership of the life growing inside me. The pregnancy became another weapon in his arsenal. We must be careful with you now, he would say, his hands exploring my changing body with the excuse of paternal concern. Mustn't take any risks with my grandchild. I was living in a waking nightmare, my body no longer my own. My child already claimed by a man who saw people as possessions to be collected and used. Every kick from the baby felt like a reminder of my captivity. Every month that passed brought me closer to bringing an innocent life into this toxic world. It was during my 7th month that everything changed. March 15th, 1962. A date burned into my memory like a brand. Anthony had gone to Richmond again, this time for a week-long conference on modern textile manufacturing. I was alone in the house, my belly enormous and heavy, when Jerome arrived with his usual presumptuous familiarity. "My dear daughter," he said, settling into Anthony's chair like a king claiming his throne. "You look radiant. Pregnancy suits you." I said nothing. I had learned that silence was sometimes the safest response. "I've been thinking about names," he continued, his eyes never leaving my face. "If it's a boy, perhaps Jerome Jr. If it's a girl, maybe something delicate. Something that suits the Wilson legacy." The casual assumption that he would name my child, that he had any say in decisions about my baby, sparked something inside me. A small flame of rebellion that I'd thought was completely extinguished. "Anthony and I will choose the name," I said quietly. Jerome's eyebrows rose. "Oh, and what role do you think you'll play in this child's life, Helen?" "You'll be the mother, certainly, but I'll be the grandfather. The head of the family. The one who determines this child's future." He stood up, moved toward me with the predatory grace of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "In fact, I think it's time we discussed your future role in this family. Your responsibilities as a Wilson woman." His hands found my shoulders squeezed just hard enough to remind me of his strength. "You've done well so far, Helen. You've been accommodating. But motherhood requires even greater dedication, greater sacrifice." The words hit me like physical blows. I understood what he was saying, that the birth of my child wouldn't end my torment, it would intensify it. That he intended to use my maternal instincts as another form of control. "I won't let you," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. His grip tightened. "Won't let me what?" "I won't let you hurt my child the way you've hurt me." The silence that followed was deafening. Jerome's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, anger, and finally a cold calculation that terrified me more than his rage. "Hurt you," he said softly. "My dear Helen, I think the pregnancy has affected your mind. I've never hurt you. I've been nothing but kind to you. Generous, protective. You know that's not true." "Do I?" He released my shoulders, stepped back, but his eyes remained fixed on mine. "And even if it were true, who would believe you? Who would believe that Jerome Wilson, pillar of the community, respected businessman, loving father and grandfather, would do anything inappropriate to his son's wife?" The words were familiar, the same threats he'd made in the rose garden, but something had changed. I was no longer the terrified girl who had believed she had no choices. I was a woman carrying a child, and that child had given me something I'd lost the will to fight. "I would tell Anthony," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Anthony wouldn't believe you," Jerome replied with infuriating certainty. "Anthony worships me. He thinks I'm the finest man who ever lived. If you tried to poison him against me, he'd assume you were having some sort of breakdown. Pregnancy can do that to women, you know. Make them hysterical, delusional." He moved closer again, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But let's say for argument's sake that Anthony did believe you. Let's say he chose to side with his wife over his father. What then? I'd disown him. Cut him off completely. He'd lose his inheritance, his position at the factory, his future. You'd be responsible for destroying the man you claim to love." The logic was perfect, the trap complete. Either way, I lost. Either way, the people I loved paid the price for my defiance. You're a monster, I whispered. I'm a realist, he corrected. And I'm a patient man. I can wait for you to come to your senses, but I won't wait forever. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Helen, that pretty dress you're wearing, it would be such a shame if something happened to it. Such a waste. He reached out and touched the fabric at my shoulder, his fingers tracing the seam. Then, with casual brutality, he hooked his finger under the neckline and pulled. The sound of tearing fabric filled the room. The cream-colored material that I'd sewn with such care split along the shoulder seam, exposing my bare skin to the afternoon light. It was a small destruction, barely noticeable, but it carried the weight of a much larger threat. Accidents happen, Jerome said mildly, especially to delicate things. He left me standing there with my torn dress and my racing heart, understanding, for the first time, that I wasn't just dealing with a man who wanted to control me. I was dealing with a man who would destroy anything and anyone who got in his way. That night, I sat in my bedroom and made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't save myself, not yet. But I could save my child. I could break this cycle before it claimed another generation. I just had to figure out how to do it without destroying everyone I loved in the process. The opportunity came 3 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon that seemed no different from any other. Anthony was at the factory dealing with a problem in the dyeing department. I was in the bedroom trying to nap away the exhaustion that had become my constant companion when I heard the familiar sound of Jerome's key in the lock. My heart began to race, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was anticipation. For weeks, I'd been planning, preparing, gathering courage, like a miser hoarding coins. Today, I was going to fight back. Helen. Jerome's voice drifted up the stairs. Are you resting, my dear? I'm here, I called back, my voice carefully neutral. His footsteps on the stairs sounded like a countdown. Each step brought him closer to the moment when everything would change. I positioned myself by the window, where the afternoon light would illuminate my face, where Anthony would see me clearly when he returned. Because Anthony was going to return. I'd arranged it. That morning, I'd called the factory and left a message with his secretary. Please tell Mr. Wilson that his wife needs him to come home early. It's urgent. I'd gambled that Anthony's concern for his pregnant wife would override his dedication to work. I'd gambled that love would prove stronger than habit. I was about to find out if I'd been right. Jerome entered the bedroom with his usual presumptuous familiarity, but something in my posture must have warned him that today was different. He paused in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. You seem alert, he observed. Not tired at all. I'm not tired, I replied, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. I'm done being tired. He moved closer, but cautiously, like a man approaching a dog that might bite. Done being tired. What an interesting choice of words. I'm done with a lot of things, I said, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in 2 years. I'm done being afraid. I'm done being silent. I'm done pretending that what you're doing to me is normal or acceptable. His expression shifted from caution to anger. I see. And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it? I'm going to tell Anthony the truth. All of it. Every detail. Jerome laughed, but there was no humor in it. We've discussed this before, Helen. Anthony won't believe you. And even if he did, he would believe me, I interrupted. If he saw it happening, if he walked in right now and saw your hands on me, he would believe me. Understanding dawned in Jerome's eyes. You called him. I called him. When he should be here any minute. Jerome's face went through several emotions, anger, fear, calculation. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. Clever girl, but you've made a mistake. Have I? You've forgotten who I am, what I'm capable of. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. If Anthony walks in here, I'll simply say you seduced me, that you've been throwing yourself at me for months, and I finally gave in to your advances. A pregnant woman driven by hormones and unhappiness in her marriage making inappropriate advances to her father-in-law. The words hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't considered that possibility that Jerome would turn my accusations around, make me the aggressor instead of the victim. No one would believe that, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Wouldn't they? You're young, attractive, married to a man who works long hours and pays you little attention. I'm a respected member of the community, a man who would never initiate such behavior. Which story sounds more believable? He was right, and we both knew it. In 1962, a woman's word against a man's was worth very little. A young woman's word against a powerful man's was worth nothing at all. You're forgetting something, I said, playing my last card. Mrs. Cecilia. Jerome's confidence wavered for just a moment. What about her? She knows? She's always known? She's been watching you, Jerome. She's been keeping track of your activities, and she's been keeping records. It was a lie, but it was a lie based on intuition. I'd seen the way Mrs. Cecilia watched her husband, the way she always seemed to know more than she let on. I'd seen the sadness in her eyes when she looked at me, the guilt that suggested she knew exactly what was happening in her son's house. You're bluffing, Jerome said, but his voice lacked certainty. Why don't you ask her she's downstairs? That was also a lie, but Jerome couldn't know that. He moved to the window, looking down at the driveway, searching for his wife's car. In that moment of distraction, I made my move. I lunged for the bedside table, grabbing the letter opener that Anthony kept there for opening business correspondence. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was sharp enough to draw blood, and sometimes the threat of violence was as effective as violence itself. Jerome turned back to me, saw the letter opener in my hand, and his expression shifted from anger to something approaching respect. Now this is interesting, he said. The little mouse has found some claws. Get out, I said, my voice shaking but determined. Get out of my house and stay away from me. Your house? He laughed. My dear Helen, this is my house. I bought it, I furnished it, I pay for its upkeep. You're just a tenant here, and tenants can be evicted. Then evict me. I'd rather live in the street than spend another day under your control. And your child? Would you rather your child lived in the street too? Or perhaps you'd prefer your child to grow up without a father? Because that's what will happen if you destroy Anthony's relationship with me. The words hit their target. My hand wavered the letter opener, suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. You would punish an innocent child for my defiance, I whispered. I would protect my family's interests, Jerome replied, including the interests of my grandchild. A child who deserves to grow up in comfort and security, not in the shadow of his mother's hysteria. We stared at each other across the bedroom, two people locked in a battle that had been building for 2 years. The afternoon light streaming through the window seemed to highlight the absurdity of the situation. A heavily pregnant woman threatening a powerful man with a letter opener, both of them frozen in a tableau of mutual destruction. Then we heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Anthony was home. Jerome's eyes flicked toward the window, then back to me. Put that down, Helen. Put it down, and we'll pretend this never happened. No, I said, but my voice was weak. I'm done pretending. Then you're done with everything, he replied, moving toward me with sudden, vicious intent. Give me that before you hurt yourself. He reached for the letter opener, and I pulled back instinctively. The blade caught the light flashed between us, and then there was blood on Jerome's hand where he'd grabbed for it. Not much blood. Just a thin line across his palm where the sharp edge had caught him. But it was enough. You cut me, he said, staring at his hand in amazement. You actually cut me. I warned you, I said, backing toward the door. I told you to stay away. You're going to regret this, Helen. You're going to regret this for the rest of your life. That's when the bedroom door opened and Anthony walked in. The scene that greeted him was impossible to misinterpret. His father, holding a bleeding hand, his wife backed against the wall with a letter opener. Both of them breathing heavily, the air thick with tension and unspoken accusations. What the hell is going on here? Anthony's voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in it that I'd never heard before. Jerome was the first to speak. Your wife has had some sort of breakdown. She attacked me with that letter opener. I think the pregnancy has affected her mind. Anthony looked from his father to me, his eyes asking questions I wasn't sure I was brave enough to answer. Is that true, Helen? He asked quietly. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment when I would finally tell the truth. But looking at Anthony's face, seeing the confusion and pain there, I realized that Jerome had been right about one thing: the truth was going to destroy the man I loved. I started, then stopped. The words seemed too large, too terrible to speak aloud. She's been making accusations, Jerome said quickly, claiming that I've been inappropriate with her. It's clearly a delusion brought on by the stress of pregnancy. Helen. Anthony's voice was gentle, but there was something underneath it, a warning perhaps, or a plea. Is that what you're saying? I looked at my husband, the man I'd married with such hope, and I made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Yes, I whispered. That's what I'm saying. The silence that followed was deafening. Anthony looked from me to his father, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. Jerome straightened his jacket, the bleeding on his hand already slowing. I think, Anthony said finally, that we need to have a conversation. All of us. Right now. Son Jerome began, I think it would be better if... Sit down, father. Anthony interrupted his voice, carrying an authority I'd never heard before. Helen, you sit down too. And somebody is going to tell me exactly what's been happening in my house. I sat on the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. Jerome remained standing, his wounded hand pressed against his chest like a badge of martyrdom. I've been concerned about Helen's emotional state. Jerome began, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man explaining a difficult situation. She's been unstable lately, making wild accusations, behaving erratically. I thought it was just the stress of pregnancy, but today she became violent. Anthony's eyes never left my face. Helen, is that your version of events? This was my last chance. My last opportunity to tell the truth, to break the cycle of silence that had trapped me for 2 years. I looked at my husband, at the man I'd promised to love and honor, and I found my voice. Your father has been visiting me when you're not here, I said quietly. He's been touching me, threatening me, forcing me to accommodate him. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Anthony's face went completely still, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my heart race. That's ridiculous, Jerome said quickly. She's obviously having some sort of breakdown. These kinds of delusions are common in pregnant women. How long? Anthony asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Since before our wedding, I replied. It started during the engagement. It's been happening all along. Anthony turned to his father, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. It wasn't surprise or disbelief. It was recognition. Get out, Anthony said quietly. Son, you can't possibly believe that. Get out of my house. Anthony's voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. Get out before I do something we'll both regret. Jerome's face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You're going to believe the hysterical accusations of a woman who just attacked me with a weapon? I'm going to believe my wife, Anthony replied. I'm going to believe the woman who just risked everything to tell me the truth. The truth? Jerome laughed bitterly. You want the truth? The truth is that your wife has been throwing herself at me for months. The truth is that she's been trying to seduce me, and when I rejected her advances, she became vindictive. Anthony moved so fast that I didn't see it coming. One moment he was standing by the door, the next moment his fist connected with his father's jaw, with a sound like breaking wood. Jerome stumbled backward, his hand going to his face, his eyes wide with shock. "Don't," Anthony said, his voice deadly quiet. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on her. You would hit your own father." Jerome gasped, blood trickling from his split lip. "Yeah, I would do anything to protect you," Anthony replied, his voice trembling with rage. "If I thought it would undo the damage you've done to my wife, I would make you pay for every moment of pain you've caused her." The room fell silent, except for the sound of our breathing. Jerome straightened his jacket, wiped the blood from his mouth, and looked at both of us with an expression of pure hatred. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "Both of you. You think you can survive without me? You think you can make it on your own? You're nothing without the Wilson name, without my money, without my protection." "Then we'll be nothing," Anthony replied. "But we'll be nothing together." Jerome looked at me one last time, his eyes promising retribution, then turned and walked out of the room. A few moments later, we heard the front door slam. I sat on the bed, staring at my hands, unable to process what had just happened. Anthony knelt beside me, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Helen," he said softly, "look at me." I raised my eyes to his, expecting to see accusation or doubt. Instead, I saw something that made my heart break, love and guilt, and a pain so deep it seemed to reach into his soul. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you." "You couldn't have known," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were true. Had there been signs he'd missed, opportunities he'd ignored? "I should have known," he replied. "I should have seen what was happening. I should have been here." We held each other on that bed, two people who had been living in the same house, but different worlds, finally sharing the same reality. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, and somewhere in the distance, a phone was ringing. It was the beginning of the end of our old life, and the beginning of something new. Something harder, but also something true. The next morning, Anthony called in sick to work for the first time in his life. We spent the day talking, planning, trying to figure out how to move forward. By evening, we had made our decision we would leave Riverdale. "We'll go to Richmond," Anthony said. "Or maybe even further. Somewhere his influence can't reach us." What about the factory? Your inheritance?" "I don't want his money," Anthony replied. "I don't want anything that comes from him." Within a week, we had sold what we could, packed what we couldn't bear to leave behind, and bought 2 bus tickets to Boston. Mrs. Cecilia chose to come with us, abandoning her marriage and her social position to stand with her son and daughter-in-law. "I should have done this years ago," she said as we waited for the bus. I should have stopped him the first time I suspected. My silence made me complicit. The bus ride to Boston was the longest journey of my life, but also the most hopeful. With every mile we traveled, I felt lighter, freer, as if I was shedding the weight of secrets and fear that had been crushing me for 2 years. We arrived in Boston with less than $300, no job prospects, and a baby due in 2 months. But we also arrived with something we'd never had before: the truth between us and the freedom to build a life based on honesty rather than lies. It wasn't easy. Those first years in Boston were marked by poverty, uncertainty, and the constant fear that Jerome would find us. Anthony took whatever work he could find, often laboring in factories for a fraction of what he'd earned in Riverdale. I learned to stretch every dollar to make meals from scraps, to find joy in small victories. But we survived. More than survived, we thrived. Our daughter Sarah was born in May 1962, a perfect, healthy baby who seemed to embody all our hopes for the future. 2 years later, we had Michael, and 2 years after that, David. Our family grew in love and laughter, filling our small apartment with the kind of happiness I'd never thought possible. Anthony started his own small business, a textile consulting firm, that capitalized on his expertise while keeping him independent of his father's influence. I returned to teaching working part-time at a local elementary school, where my love for children found new expression. Mrs. Cecilia became the grandmother I'd never had a woman who had transformed her own guilt into a fierce determination to protect her new family. She helped with the children manage the household and became my closest friend and confidant. We heard news from Riverdale, occasionally letters from former neighbors, newspaper clippings sent by well-meaning friends. Jerome had remarried a woman 20 years younger who bore him a son. The factory had expanded, his political influence had grown, and his reputation as a pillar of the community remained intact. "Does it bother you?" Anthony asked one evening after we'd received a particularly glowing article about his father's latest civic contribution. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But then I look at our children, at the life we've built, and I realize that we won. We got away. We're free. And he's still trapped," Anthony added quietly. Trapped in his own emptiness, his own need to control and hurt others. In the end, we're the ones who escaped. For 15 years, we lived in Boston, building our family and our business, healing from the trauma of our past. I thought our story was over, that we had successfully closed the book on the nightmare that had defined our early marriage. I was wrong. In 1977, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was from a young woman named Rebecca, who had tracked us down through a series of careful inquiries. She worked at Jerome's factory, lived in the same company housing where I had once lived, and was experiencing the same pattern of abuse that had nearly destroyed me. "I read about your story in some old newspapers," she wrote. "I know what happened to you, and I know the same thing is happening to me. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help me." I stared at that letter for hours, feeling the weight of 15 years of hard-won peace suddenly threatened by the ghosts of my past. Anthony found me sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread in front of me, tears streaming down my face. "What is it?" he asked, but I think he already knew. "He's still doing it," I whispered. "After all these years, he's still hurting people." Anthony read the letter, his face growing darker with each word. "We have to help her." "How? We're 500 miles away. We have no influence there. We barely escaped ourselves." "We have something now that we didn't have then," Anthony said quietly. "We have our voices. We have our story. And we have the power to make sure this stops." That night, we made a decision that would define the rest of our lives. We would go back to Riverdale, not to hide or run or simply survive, but to fight. We would use our experience, our knowledge, our hard-won strength to break the cycle of silence and abuse that had allowed Jerome Wilson to hurt so many people. The return to Riverdale was like stepping into a dream or a nightmare. The town had grown modernized, but the essential power structure remained the same. Jerome was older now, grayer, but still commanding, still respected, still untouchable. We arrived quietly, renting a small house on the outskirts of town, and began the careful work of building a case against a man who had spent decades perfecting his public image. It wasn't easy. Many of his victims were too frightened to speak out, too convinced that they would be blamed or ignored. But Rebecca was brave, and her bravery inspired others. One by one, women came forward with their stories, factory workers, secretaries, wives of men who worked for Jerome Young, women who had been trapped in the same web of power and silence that had once held me. The case took 2 years to build. 2 years of careful investigation, of gathering evidence, of convincing witnesses to testify. Jerome fought back with all the weapons at his disposal: intimidation, bribery, character assassination. He hired the best lawyers, called in political favors, used every tool of power and influence he had accumulated over decades. But times had changed. The women's movement had gained strength, the legal system had evolved, and society was beginning to recognize that powerful men were not above the law. When Jerome Wilson finally went on trial in 1980, the courtroom was packed with supporters and detractors, reporters and activists, victims and their families. I testified on the second day of the trial, telling my story publicly for the first time. The courtroom was silent as I described the pattern of abuse, the threats, the years of fear and silence. When I finished, several of the jurors were crying. Jerome was convicted on multiple counts of sexual assault and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was 72 years old when he was led away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling around him. The victory felt both enormous and hollow. Justice had been served, but it had come decades too late for many of his victims. The damage he had done to so many lives could never be fully repaired. But something else had emerged from the trial. A network of women who had found their voices, who had learned to support each other, who had discovered that the shame they carried belonged to their abuser, not to them. We stayed in Riverdale for another year, helping to establish a crisis center for women and children, working to change the culture that had allowed abuse to flourish in silence. Then we returned to Boston, to our children and our business, to the life we had built from the ashes of our past. Jerome died in prison in 1985, alone and forgotten. I felt no joy when I heard the news, but I did feel a sense of closure. The man who had cast such a long shadow over my life was gone, and his victims could finally rest, knowing that he would never hurt anyone again. In the years that followed, Anthony and I dedicated ourselves to advocacy work, speaking at conferences, supporting other survivors, helping to change laws and attitudes. Our children grew up understanding that their parents' story was part of a larger narrative about power abuse and the importance of speaking truth to authority. Sarah became a social worker specializing in family counseling. Michael became a lawyer focusing on civil rights cases. David became a teacher carrying on the family tradition of nurturing young minds. Mrs. Cecilia lived to be 89, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1995. Her final years were filled with the joy of great-grandchildren and the satisfaction of knowing that her silence had finally been broken, that her courage to stand with us had helped save countless other lives. Anthony and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary in 2000, surrounded by our children and grandchildren in the Boston home we had built together. We had survived trauma, poverty, fear, and public scrutiny to build something beautiful and lasting. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him that night as we sat on our porch watching the sunset. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had stayed silent?" "Never," he replied, taking my hand in his. "We couldn't have lived with ourselves, and our children would have grown up in a world where men like my father could act with impunity." "But it cost us so much," I said. "Your inheritance, your relationship with your father, so many years of struggle." "It cost us things we never should have wanted," he corrected. "And it gave us things we never could have imagined." "Look at our family, Helen. Look at what we've built together. Look at the lives we've touched, the changes we've helped create." He was right. Our story, which had begun with such trauma and pain, had become something larger than our individual experience. It had become a testament to the power of truth, the importance of courage, and the possibility of healing. Anthony passed away in 2010 after a brief illness. His last words to me were, "Thank you for saving us all." I'm 84 now, living in a small apartment near Sarah's family, surrounded by photographs of the life Anthony and I built together. I speak occasionally at conferences and schools, sharing my story with new generations of young women who face their own struggles with power and abuse. The world has changed dramatically since that afternoon in 1962 when I first found the courage to fight back. Women's voices are stronger now, legal protections are better, and the culture of silence that once protected men like Jerome Wilson has been significantly weakened. But the work isn't finished. It may never be finished. Each generation must find its own voice, its own courage, its own way to stand against the forces that would silence and oppress. My story isn't unique. It's the story of countless women who have faced similar challenges, who have found similar courage, who have made similar sacrifices to protect themselves and their families. What makes my story worth telling is not its uniqueness, but its universality. We all have moments when we must choose between silence and truth, between safety and justice, between protecting ourselves and protecting others. The choice isn't always clear, and the consequences aren't always fair. But the choice is always there waiting for us to find the courage to make it. I chose truth. I chose justice. I chose to speak when speaking was dangerous to fight, when fighting seemed impossible to hope, when hope seemed foolish. And in the end, I chose correctly. Not because the outcome was perfect, but because the alternative continued. Silence, continued suffering, continued complicity in my own oppression was unthinkable. The sound of my wedding dress tearing still echoes in my memory, but it no longer fills me with fear. Instead, it reminds me of the moment when I stopped being a victim and became a survivor. The moment when I stopped accepting the world as it was and started working to make it what it should be. That's my story. That's my legacy. That's the gift I leave to the generations who will come after me, the knowledge that silence is not survival, that compliance is not peace, and that the courage to speak the truth, no matter how dangerous, is always worth the price. The monsters of this world depend on our silence. They count on our fear, our shame, our unwillingness to fight back. But they underestimate us at their own peril. We are stronger than we know, braver than we believe, and more connected to each other than they can imagine. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, when the light slants through my windows just right, I can still hear it, not the sound of fabric tearing, but the sound of chains, breaking of voices, rising of truth finally setting us free.